Imagine you are a rescue worker. You arrive in a city of 30,000 people, and you find 30,000 bodies in under 2 minutes. Men sitting at cafe tables, forks still raised toward their mouths. Women with their hands frozen on door handles, locked in the gesture of entering or leaving. Children in the middle of games, motionless as wax figures. The clothes are intact. Not a single burn, not a tear, not a trace of flame. The wood around them has not burned. The tablecloths are still clean. The morning newspapers are still readable. But inside every single body, everything has been incinerated. Organs reduced to ash. Lungs destroyed in a fraction of a second. One survivor at the heart of it all. A prisoner, saved by the concrete walls of his punishment cell. So here are the 2 questions that will drive everything you are about to hear. What force is capable of killing 30,000 people without touching their clothes? And why did those 30,000 people wait to die when nature itself had been screaming at them to leave for an entire month? The answer is not in the geology. It is in the politics. They called Saint-Pierre the Paris of the West Indies. Whitewashed facades, electric streetlights, warm bread in the soft Caribbean air. 26,000 residents in the city proper, thousands more in the surrounding parishes. The harbor was one of the busiest in the region. The cafes were full. Life there had a particular quality. Warm, slow, almost careless. Mont Pelée rose on the horizon like a stage backdrop. A mountain. Just a mountain. Nobody really looked at it. Then, in the spring of 1902, the mountain began to come apart. First came the smells. Sulfur invaded the rivers, turning the water into a rust-colored, rancid sludge. Then the heat. The soil on the mountain slopes grew hot enough to drive everything living off of it. And everything living up there came down into the city. Thousands of snakes. Fer-de-lance vipers, the most dangerous in the Caribbean, some nearly 6 feet long. They flooded the streets, the gardens, the houses. Around 50 people died from bites. Hundreds of farm animals were killed. Residents walked everywhere looking down at the ground with every step. The mountain was literally expelling life from its body. And yet, the population of Saint-Pierre did not fall. It grew. It swelled to approximately 30,000 people. Why? Because you could not leave. Ships in the harbor had been ordered not to sail. Soldiers were patrolling the roads. Leaving the city required special permission. Saint-Pierre was, in every meaningful sense, sealed under a glass dome. And behind that dome stood one man, Governor Ludger Mouttet. The governor understood the arithmetic of the situation precisely. Evacuation meant panic. Panic meant chaos. And chaos meant something utterly unacceptable to him. Canceling the legislative elections scheduled for May 11th, 1902. So he did what men of power do when reality becomes inconvenient. He rewrote it. He convened a scientific commission. Not one volcanologist among its members. And the local newspaper, the government's unofficial mouthpiece, printed exactly what the governor needed people to read. Saint-Pierre was as safe as Naples at the foot of Vesuvius. The population could sleep soundly. The governor compared his city to Pompeii, 3 days before a pyroclastic event. 30,000 people stayed. The key to the city was in his pocket. Meanwhile, inside the mountain, a bomb was building with absolute indifference to the electoral calendar. To understand what was about to happen, you need to forget everything you think you know about volcanoes. Forget those slow-moving rivers of glowing red lava that people film up close with their phones. That kind of volcanism exists, but it has nothing to do with what was hiding inside Mont Pelée. Pelée's magma was andesitic, saturated with silica, thick as cooling concrete. When you try to push this type of magma up through a volcanic conduit, the gas trapped inside cannot escape gradually. It stays locked in. The pressure builds, keeps building, and keeps building. Imagine a champagne bottle that has been shaken for 2 solid weeks. Now replace the cork with a block of lead welded shut. That is exactly what the summit of Mont Pelée looked like in early May 1902. A lava dome had formed, sealing the conduit like a cap made of several million tons of rock. Rigid, impenetrable. The pressure accumulated below had nowhere to go upward. Only one option remained: go sideways. May 8th, 1902, Thursday, Ascension Day. The city is eating breakfast. A planter named Fernand Clerc is standing at his barometer. The needle is not falling the way it normally does. It is convulsing, lurching back and forth across the dial in violent, irregular pulses, as if the instrument has lost its mind. That is, in fact, exactly how he described it in his written account afterward. Fernand Clerc does not stop to analyze. He grabs his family, pushes past the military checkpoints, and runs. At 7:52 in the morning, the southern flank of Mont Pelée fails. Not the top, the side. What comes out of it had no name in the scientific vocabulary of that era. The French later called it nuée ardente, glowing cloud. Today, science calls it a pyroclastic density current. And to understand why this phenomenon is uniquely and absolutely lethal, you have to understand its mechanics. Inside the current, rock particles are not grinding against each other. They are floating, suspended on a cushion of constantly expanding superheated gas. There is no friction between the particles, no drag. The material does not roll or tumble. It flows the way liquid flows. Except no liquid on Earth moves like this. The valley below acted as a rifle barrel. It pointed directly at Saint-Pierre. The distance was approximately 5 miles. Travel time was between 90 seconds and 2 minutes. Speed on impact estimates range from 220 to nearly 400 miles per hour. The telegraph line went silent in the middle of a transmission. It never came back on. The pressure wave arrived first, before anything was visible, before the heat. Stone facades several feet thick did not simply crack. They exploded outward from the inside. Outside air pressure dropped so abruptly that the air trapped within the walls had nowhere to go except through them. The buildings were not knocked over. They were detonated. Then the current hit. Superheated gas, ash, and rock pulverized to fine powder. This mass filled every street, every room, every space between buildings, simultaneously, at a temperature of around 750 degrees Fahrenheit and around 400 degrees Celsius. Everything arrived at once. There was no sequence of events for the human body to process. In a single breath, the moisture in the lungs vaporized instantly. When water becomes steam, it expands by a factor of roughly 1,700. Lung tissue ruptured in fractions of a second. Cerebrospinal fluid reached boiling point. The nervous system shut down before the brain could register pain. People died before their bodies reached the ground. Cadaveric spasm locked the muscles exactly where they were at the moment of death. That is why the men were still holding their forks. That is why the women still had their hands on the door handles. The clothing stayed intact because this was not fire, not flames. It was a pressurized, particle-dense mass moving at extraordinary speed. Combustion requires time and oxygen, and the pyroclastic current provided neither. The heat was lethal. The clothes did not burn. This is not a paradox. It is the specific signature of this specific type of event. In the harbor, the current hit the surface of the sea and instantly generated a layer of steam beneath itself, skimming across the water like a blade. The ocean boiled. Sailors who had jumped from burning ships were scalded alive in the sea. Ships that had been ordered to remain at anchor were torn apart. Governor Mouttet died with his election. The entire city was gone in under 2 minutes. One single human being survived at the epicenter. His name was Ludger Sylbaris, a prisoner convicted of brawling. He was locked in a punishment cell, carved into the rock, a cell with one single opening, a narrow slit set high up, facing away from the mountain. He had packed that slit with wet cloth. He suffered severe burns over much of his body. He remained in total darkness for days, without food, without water, without any way of knowing whether the world still existed on the other side of that wall. The punishment cell was the only adequate shelter in the entire city. Rescue teams took several days before they heard him shouting. He survived. He was pardoned. A few years later, he joined the Barnum and Bailey Circus, touring the world and displaying his scars under the banner of the luckiest man alive. In the months following the catastrophe, something extraordinary happened. The same dense, viscous magma that had blocked the upward explosion began slowly extruding through the shattered conduit. It formed a spine of solid, cooling rock, rising at roughly 50 feet per day above the crater. It reached approximately 1,000 feet in height. Its volume was roughly comparable to that of the Great Pyramid of Giza. The mountain was building a monument above its dead. The spine held for several months. Then it collapsed under its own weight. Now let us step back, because the real story here is not a story about volcanology. That would be too simple, too comfortable, too easy to file under natural disaster and move on. What happened in Saint-Pierre on May 8th, 1902, is the story of what occurs when a political system decides that its own interests matter more than the truth. Nature had done its job. For an entire month, Mont Pelée had sent signals that were impossible to ignore. Signals that any human being in full possession of their senses would have understood without needing a degree in earth sciences. Poisoned rivers, heat rising through the soil, snakes in the streets, instruments convulsing, permanent smoke on the horizon, the smell of sulfur in your sheets every morning. Every signal a dying mountain knows how to send. But between those signals and the 30,000 people who should have responded to them, stood one man, a man with an election in his head and a pen in his hand, a man who had the power to write reality in place of living it, and around him, a set of institutions, a newspaper, a sham scientific commission, soldiers at road checkpoints, all set in motion to serve one single purpose: keep things in place until May 11th. Geological pressure does not negotiate. Physics extended no courtesy to the governor's ambitions. Mont Pelée is still active today. The valley still faces the town below. The mechanics are identical. The andesitic magma still exists. Pyroclastic currents are still possible. The only variable that has ever mattered is this one. When the needle starts convulsing, is there anyone willing to leave without waiting for permission? Saint-Pierre is not just a lesson in volcanology. It is a test that human societies take over and over again, in different forms, in different contexts, with different instruments convulsing for different reasons. And every single time, the question is the same. Who has the right to read the signals? Who holds the power to decide what they mean? And how many people have to die before the truth takes back the floor from the official narrative? The 30,000 residents of Saint-Pierre were not killed by a volcano. They were killed by May 11th.